Hey, everybody, and welcome to our Thursday, what is it? July 18th already, edition of our Children's Lit Show online. We do have the real king of the household here. Got to make himself look handsome. I better stop there before he ventures into more private areas, which he is prone to do. Anyway, so Charlie is on board today. Hope you're all having a good week. Couple things I want to go over today. It'll probably be one of our shorter videos. In fact, actually, I think from now on, the videos will probably be a little bit shorter than they have been. We're at the time of the semester where if we were doing a regular class of 15 weeks, there would be a lot of time spent in class having students do their presentations in class. And of course, we don't do that online. Also, over the course of these weeks, I like to show not the entire movie versions of these works, but I like to show some portions of things like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and Charlotte's Web. And previously, I like to show scenes from the Hunger Games. And of course, we're not doing any of that. So we're saving time. We're saving class time. You're still doing the same amount of work, but there's less class time involved. So that means maybe less video time, me talking at you from now on. Couple of things before we get started. Just some comments on the final, not the final, the midterm exam. Most of you did very, very well on the midterm exam. I hope that worked for you. I sent by email the grades that you got on the midterm, and then also obviously put them in Canvas. If you have any questions about particular points I took off here or there for particular answers to questions, let me know. Nobody emailed me about that, so I guess everybody's pretty cool with their grade and don't have any questions. But if you still do have questions about that, feel free to let me know, and I can go over the exam in more detail. But like I said, most of you did very well. We had quite a number of 100, so everybody, or I should say, a lot of people did very well and got all the questions right, and some of the answers were very, very good. So anyway, that's all I have to say about that, as Forrest Gump would say. Let me explain a couple of things about what's coming up for Sunday into Monday. I'm going to ask you to read our second example of fantasy. This would be an example of high fantasy, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And let me go over the assignment for you. And again, this is in Canvas. So this will be the assignment that's due by midnight Sunday. Obviously, watch this lecture. And let me give you a number right away. How about, I don't know, 44 will be our first number. So take note of the numbers in sequence and include them in the homework as you've been doing all along. I don't know why I feel the need to put this in the assignment, but I do, just to remind you, you do have to watch me yak at you. That's part of the deal. And then jot down the numbers and include them with the homework. All right, I would like you to read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It is an example of high fantasy, so a little bit more sophisticated for a little bit older audience, but I still think it's a work for children. As Charlotte's Web was an example of light fantasy, I think Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the series of books in the Narnia series would be considered high fantasy. So please read all of that. And then for your, we'll make it a 40-point quiz. There's actually two separate assignments. I didn't put them together because in most cases in the regular semester, we do them separately. Usually do one in class and then one for homework, but since we're online, you're going to be doing both of them for homework. So there are a series of questions on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that I would like you to answer. I'll go over that in a second. And then there's also what I call the fantasy assignment, which is also given in the Canvas, which I'll go over in a second. So answer all of those assigned things. They're on two separate files, but I want you to put them together into one 40-point quiz, and then email me in one email, not two emails, but in one email, your answers to both assignments. That will be due. Also, if you are in the fantasy group of presenters, your fantasy assignment is due, the written part. And again, I will compile all those and make them available on Canvas. And I will do as I did for the midterm. Then starting here to the end, students will be responsible for reading the other students' presentations. Okay, so, and that's Emma, Jenna, Irale, and Corinne are in that group. So there are 4 students in the fantasy group of presentations. So those are due this weekend by Sunday at midnight. And then also I'll remind you, looking ahead next week, the author profiles will be due before next Thursday's class. And if you want to start reading ahead, we're going to start getting into the next genre of literature for kids, which would be realistic fiction. And our first example of that would be Bridge to Terabithia. And well, I was going to give away some plot points, but I won't. I'll just keep my mouth shut in case you haven't read it. There's a pretty good movie version of it as well. But anyway, and again, if we were in a regular classroom situation in 15 weeks, we'd show a little bit of the movie, but we're not going to do that. So that saves us time. But anyway, so those are the assignments. Read the first book in the Narnia series, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Answer the questions in the 2 assignments. And then if you are in the presentation that's fantasy, those are going to be due as well. All right. Let me go to the 2 assignments, just so you might not have any questions if I go over them. Where are we? Here we go. All right, I have a series of questions here on Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I feature Charlie as Aslan. He looked like a lion there. So I thought, actually, I think he was yawning or something. Or actually, I think he was about ready to bite me. I can't remember what he was doing. But anyway, oh, and again, oh, there he is. So there's Aslan in repose here. So anyway, I have a bunch of questions, 18 in all, but the ones I want, you can look them all over. You should look them all over in case we talk about them, or maybe I were to ask you about them on the final exam or whatever. But the ones I want you to answer, very short answer, are the ones that are highlighted, okay? And for that, I'll get you 20 points. I think they're all pretty self-explanatory. Maybe the most important question is number 17. And that's the one that deals with something I talked about in our last video. You know, how does the creator of the fantasy make his or her fantasy world believable, even though we know it's not real? How do they help us suspend our disbelief? And so number 17 asks you, what techniques does Lewis use to help make his fantasy believable? So when you get to that question, go back to the notes that I went over in our last video. And I think you're going to see, maybe not each and every one of them, but I think you'll see a number of them used to help make the fantasy more believable and help us suspend disbelief. So just answer the ones that are highlighted. And let me give you another number here. Second number is 66. 66. Okay. So that's the first part of the homework, to answer those questions. And then, because fantasy is a genre that has boomed, has continued to keep booming in the last 10, 20, 30 years, fantasy for kids. And I'm not just talking about books now. I'm talking about movies and cartoons and TV shows and whatever. There's no shortage of great examples. Uh, I, I've been updating this list for like the last 10 years. I think the last time I updated it was like a year ago. And I just one day brainstormed and just tried to come up with all the different titles I could possibly think of that would qualify as fantasy for kids. Again, some of these might straddle the line between children's literature and young adult literature, but I think most of them are pretty clearly fantasy works for kids. A lot of them, if not most of them, are movies. Okay, and you can use movies for this assignment. But what I want you to do is, as it says here, you can choose a title from this list, maybe one of these you're familiar with, and when you see it on the list, you go, oh my God, I love that movie. I want to do the assignment on this movie. So feel free to do that. Or, like I said, I'm constantly updating it, but maybe something recently has come out that would fall into the category of fantasy that you would rather do this assignment for. Feel free. I'm always adding to the list. But again, there's so many great, and some of these are real classics, have been around forever. And then, like I said, some of them are pretty recent within the last few years. Um, so I'm assuming that you've probably experienced at least a few of these in your own childhood and would be able to do the assignment. Or like I said, maybe you have a favorite that's not listed. Feel free. But this is what I want you to do. So as it says here, choose a title from the list or one from your own choice, and then do the following checkpoints. Short answer, but I think this would be a good way to analyze yet another work of fantasy other than the two that I'm assigning all of you to read. And then, I'm not sure what the four students are going to be doing in each of their presentations. So between the two, I'm asking you to do the four that you read about for the student presentations. And then I'm going to compile all of your answers to this in Canvas so you can see how the rest of the class has analyzed others. So I'm hoping by the end we have at least a good 12, 15 titles that we can choose from. So here's what I want you to do. First of all, classify it. What kind of fantasy is it? Or it could be an example of science fiction. Is it more high fantasy or is it more light fantasy? And I probably should have added, please explain briefly. So don't just say high or light and let it go, but explain. So I went over the definitions and the distinctions between the two the other day. Then for synopsis, in a few sentences, summarize the plot of the story. And you've already had a little bit of practice in giving plot summaries, so this shouldn't be too difficult. What is the setting of the story? So describe, and again, these are two things I'm asking you for, both the time and the place where the story is set. So you could answer that in a sentence or two. Describe the main character or characters in the story. Then, this is particularly important, I think, hopefully this work, whether it's a movie, book, TV show, whatever, has, in addition to the ability to tell a really great fantasy story, hopefully it also includes maybe possible lessons, messages, morals, or what I would call themes for the child reader or child audience. So what might those be? Explain those. That might take a few sentences to do. We always talk about this. What is what would be the age appropriateness for this particular work? So what would be the best age and or grade for this particular work? And explain your answer. It's kind of an opinion question, but I'd like you to answer it. Could there potentially be any censorship issues with this work? And of course, we've talked about that, reasons why books are banned or challenged. That was a question on the midterm. So explain any if applicable. And I guess I'm kind of hoping there will be at least one or two issues, so you'll have something to write about there. And then finally, or next to final, but this is again the most important question for me, is again, how does the creator of the work use some of these techniques that we talked about to help make the fantasy believable? So again, go back to the fantasy notes file in Canvas to refresh your memory about what those are and see, and I'm willing to bet that whichever story you pick, the creator used at least a couple of these techniques because they work and they're effective. And so that's very important. And then this is the final question. What are some other qualities or criteria of good children's literature present in the story? So this goes back to the very first thing I went over at the beginning of the semester. What are the values and qualities of good children's literature? How does this work? Have some of those. So you can go back to those early notes. By the way, I've republished everything in the Canvas so that everything is accessible again, so you can go back and find that stuff in the earlier files. Okay, so that's the assignment. Actually, two-part assignment. Answer the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe questions, and then do this fantasy assignment. And in the past, in this assignment, I've had students choose 3 and do this for each of the 3, but I'm going to ask you just to do 1. So you can take one from this list or pick one of your own choosing, as long as it fits under the fantasy or science fiction genre. And remember, I went over the distinctions we make between fantasy and science fiction. They're very much related, but there is an important distinction between them. Okay, so that's the assignment. Charlie is now left. Charlie has left the building, so to speak, like Elvis. All right, the main gist of today is I did want to go over the answers to the Charlotte's Web worksheet that you had due before this class. And I compiled some of your answers to this and added a few of my own if I thought that you missed 1 or 2 things. And again, as I previewed the book the other day, and by the way, let me give you another number. How about 88? 88 is our third number. By the way, this is a poster from the most recent movie version of the book. And I say recent, I'm looking at the date here, 2006. This is a good example of how time flies. If you were to ask me, hey, when did that Charlotte's Web movie come out? I'd say, oh, probably about, I don't know, 10 years ago, but it's been like 18 years ago. Really well done. Good animation with, I don't know if you can read the names here, but a pretty all-star cast of voice actors. Julia Roberts played Charlotte, for example. There's also a classic cartoon version from the early 70s, which I would also recommend. It's not as sophisticated technology-wise, but it's still a lot of fun. So I might suggest you watch that too, maybe with your kids, or just watch it for fun. I'm sure that's on Netflix, or you could probably see the whole thing on YouTube if you wanted to. The only problem I had with I think it came out in 72 or 73, something like that. The only problem I had with that version is the actor who played Wilbur has a sweet kind of high voice, but it's obviously an adult. And it kind of, I think we're going to talk about this in a minute, but obviously Wilbur is representative of a child. He's the child symbol in the story. And then to have his voice be read by an adult who's trying to sound younger, it doesn't quite cut it. But anyway, I would still recommend that too. It's kind of fun. All right, like I said, when I previewed this, the story works on so many different levels. And I'm going to stop this just for a second. Hold on. All right, sorry about the interruption. My brother just recently broke his hip and is going through all kinds of rehab. And I was getting a call in from him, and I wanted to make sure I took it just to make sure there wasn't anything wrong. There wasn't, it's no emergency. But anyway, let's get back to what we were doing. I love how this story works on so many different levels, as many of you pointed out. So here are the questions. And I think by going over the questions and the answers, this is a good way to cover the book and anything I might want to say about it. Uh, First thing, and you noticed this, and I pointed it out, and this hints at one of the qualities of good children's literature that we went over the very first day of class. You know, one of the benefits is to broaden the child's vocabulary, and this book certainly does that. So I don't know if you read it when you were in third or fourth grade, like I did, or maybe a little bit younger, or a little bit older. Anyway, I'm sure there were some big words thrown around in the story intentionally, um, that obviously by White, as a vocabulary booster. And I can imagine any teacher who ever teaches this book would probably have a little vocabulary quiz, you know, to help them broaden their vocabulary. And so we have words like, and I usually test, if we were in class, I'd usually test the class and I'd give each one and ask them to define them just to make sure that college age students know the definitions for these. And most of these, by the way, come from Charlotte, the wise mentor spider who knows all and is kind and benevolent, and et cetera, et cetera. Salutations, humble is one of the words in the web. Versatile, radiant, gullible, injustice, campaign, complimentary. These are words you guys gave me. At some point, she admits to Wilbur that she is languishing, and he wants to know what that means. And sadly, it means that she doesn't have much longer to live. Other words like oblige, sedentary, versatile. Did I put versatile? Yeah, I did put versatile twice, excuse me. Oblige, anesthetic is used, big fancy doctor word. Loathed, inheritance, untenable, forlorn, jubilee, hullabaloo, and of course, magnum opus is a term that's very important in the story. She considers her egg sac to be her magnum opus. So many of you jotted down and noted these answers for this question. And I threw in a couple that sometimes people miss, because sometimes you're reading along and you know what they mean, and maybe they're not defined in the story by Charlotte or anybody else. But I think, White does throw in some relatively, big words, for lack of a better term, that maybe kids reading it would go scamper. Well, I was going to say they would go scamper to their dictionaries, but hell no, they're just going to go scamper to their Google and Google the word and find it out. But that's good. It broadens their vocabulary. Another thing that's very effective about the story is that it provides a great deal of information about particularly farm life and country life. And again, speaking to another quality of good children's literature, learning about, I guess, other cultures, we could say, or getting information about other lifestyles. I mentioned the other day, I'm a city kid. Closest I get to a farm is maybe an occasional county fair when I was a kid. Um, and I always remember the smell of cotton candy and manure. And I said, I always thought I always thought that I would like to live out in the country until I visited the country. And then I thought, well, I don't know. It's a little bit too slow paced for me. Plus, you got that manure all the time. But it is interesting. And I would imagine a kid reading the book for the first time, or maybe some of you are reading it for the first time as, I don't know, 20 plus years old students in a college class, maybe learned a few things that you didn't know. Maybe you didn't learn this stuff in science class. We find out, among other things, that spider sacs are waterproof to help them keep the eggs warm. We learn about her spider legs, that they have 7 parts. We find out that spiders spin different kinds of webs, for various purposes. We also find out how the spiders kill their prey, and provide a service too, by the way. I don't know that, I don't know how many of you have arachnophobia. And spiders tend to get a bad rap. We see a spider crawling around and go, ooh, a spider, kill it. But I think one of the overarching themes, and we'll get to this again in a little bit, that we learn in the story is, yeah, spiders might be creepy looking, but they actually do provide a wonderful service. They do keep the insect population, the bug population down for us. So insect control. And we find out that they don't actually eat their prey, they just sort of drink them. I don't know if that's better or worse. So again, if you come into the story with a little bit of a fear of spiders, maybe you'll learn about what they really are and what they really do, and maybe feel a little less scared of them, and maybe less likely the next time you see one to just smash it, or maybe just find a way to get it outside so it can help the ecology. This always brings me to a story. I won't take too long to do this, but we were actually doing this assignment in groups in a classroom situation. And while they were working in class, I went back up to my office. I wish I had it here. I'd show it to you. But I had a pretty good sized fake spider. And I thought it might be kind of fun to come into the class and just throw the spider on one of the desks where the groups are and just have a big laugh about it. Well, I did that, and I shouldn't laugh to this day. But unfortunately, I threw it into a group where one of the students had a very severe case of arachnophobia, and he just sort of freaked out. And oh man, I felt so bad, and I apologized profusely. He and I, this is years ago. This has got to be like 15 years ago. And uh, yeah, he accepted my apology, and so there were no lawsuits, and I kept my job. But ever since, I always tell that story, and we're friends on Facebook. And in fact, I'll have to shoot him a message today. I'll say, hey, I told your story again. We have a good laugh about that, but at the time wasn't too funny. So I'm really careful now about where I bring out my fake spider. But anyway, you learn a bunch of stuff about spiders in the book that you wouldn't necessarily know. Other things you learn about other animals too. It takes 30 days for a goose to lay an egg. We find out that pigs can burrow under dirt or mud, either to warm or cool themselves. So you wonder why pigs are always rolling around in the mud. Well, they don't just do it for fun, although maybe it's fun. Sadly, too, we learn some facts of life in the farm. The runs, the ones that aren't going to look like they're going to be very big or make it, they're killed right away. We don't mess around with them. And even the healthy pigs that are born in the spring, they're killed at Christmas time. So we have this fate hanging over Wilbur. He's almost killed as a runt, but he's saved. Excuse me. He's saved by Fern, who's taken a liking to him, which leads to one of the inconsistencies I find in the story, or maybe it's just White's commentary on human beings. But I just envisioned Fern getting all upset about, oh, no, we can't kill Wilbur. We can't, use him for food. Meanwhile, they're having breakfast and they're probably eating bacon or whatever. So I don't know. It's kind of inconsistent. Maybe it's an inconsistency, or maybe it's just the hypocrisy of the whole thing, to be concerned about animals. Meanwhile, you have ham on your plate as you're worried about killing this runt. So I'll leave that to you, whether or not it's an inconsistency in the story, or whether it's just like a commentary on us as human beings. So we learn, about farm life and about animal life, etc. I said another thing that's very important well, this is one of the ways you make the fantasy believable, is, your descriptive abilities and your use of senses, so that even though we know A lot of the story is fantastical. Um, you know, we feel like we're there. And this kind of ties in with one of the techniques used to make the fantasy believable. The very first one I listed is, notice how White does what I suggested the other day. He grounds the story in reality first. It doesn't get more real than, a Midwestern farm, you know, uh, and, in a barn and with animals like pigs and goats and whatever. And then the fantasy elements start to be introduced. Oh my gosh, the animals can talk. Oh my gosh, we have a spider who can write words in the web. And then but you know, it's easier to buy those weird things if at first everything is kind of set in a setting that we're familiar with. And even if we're not farm kids like I wasn't a farm kid. You know, we all know we all know barn animals and farm animals. Uh, Kind of goes back to the old see and say. Do you guys still have that see and say where you'd pull the string and it'd land on an animal and you'd hear what kind of sound it made? Anyway, so wonderful use of sensory details. And again, I wanted you to pick out imagery other than just what could be seen. And I think White does a really nice job of describing smells, particularly in two different settings. Obviously, the barn, but then also when they get to the carnival and the fair, all the different foods that could be smelled. Like I said, my lingering smell memory of county fairs is cotton candy and manure. Um, but he goes to the trouble of describing all the smells, the tastes of fair food, what hay smells like, the manure. There's a scene where a rotten egg breaks open, and I think we've all experienced uh, what that smells like, and you can just, I don't know, picture it in your mind's nose, I guess would be the best way to put that. Mentions the different bird songs and what they're communicating. The sounds of the stream in spring, the sounds of Wilbur eating slop, the sheep blatting in the pens, the sparrows calling out Peabody, Peabody. Even Lurvy's smell of the tobacco from his pipe. So all of these are very vivid images, sensory images that help, again, ground the story in a certain amount of reality. A lot of symbolism in the story. And as I mentioned a little bit already today, and I set it up the other day, I think Wilbur is the child representative in the story, even though he's a pig. So he's the character that the children reading the story would identify with. I mentioned, I think he is both childlike in many ways, but also childish. You know, so a lot of times kids do stuff to just drive you crazy, and it's childish actions. So I think Wilbur fits the bill. Beginning with when we first meet him and they're discussing him as a runt and whether or not they should kill him, and Firm basically treats him like a baby. Other things he does that a child would do. Remember, he does fear the spiders initially, like again, most kids would, because spiders get this bad rap that they're creepy, whatever. There are times in the story early on where he doesn't seem to have anybody to play with. He doesn't have a friend, and kids unfortunately certainly can relate to that. You got summer vacation and nobody's around to play with. Again, he's the beneficiary of learning new vocabulary that Charlotte throws out there. Again, childlike, he cries when he's upset. He's very curious. He gets bored easily, like most kids. There are a couple of scenes where, he thinks he can do anything and then he finds out he can't. Loves to play. Uh, and he is shunned by others at first, but then they eventually accept him as a friend. And again, Charlotte becomes his main number one friend. Um, he throws a lot of tantrums like kids will do. And he's very upset about Charlotte's killing those bugs until she takes the time to explain, the necessity of it. That's how she survives. And he begins to understand at least a little bit. One other one I could have mentioned, I wish I had now that I think about it, but when Charlotte does, admit to him toward the end that she is languishing and she doesn't have long to live, his initial reaction is, I would say very, again, childish and very selfish in a way. It's kind of like, oh my gosh, you can't leave me, Charlotte. What's going to become of me? It's all about, it's all about him when she's the one that's going to be dying. Um, and again, I think we could say that's a very immature reaction to this news. Um, but again, I think it's very realistic. I mean, children, are very, you know, self-centered, for lack of a better word. It's only when they get older that they realize, hey, there's other people in this world and other people have feelings too. It's not all about you. But I think, he shows that very well. And again, Charlotte, the wise mentor, kind of sets him aside and says, well, this is the circle of life. This is what happens. And I'm going to need you now. I'm going to give you the responsibility of looking after the egg sac after I'm gone. And I believe you are ready for that responsibility. And of course, that's part of his maturing process. He takes on that responsibility and he does a very good job of looking after her egg sac. Um, Other symbolism in the story, Templeton the rat. I don't know about you. I have a thing about rats, so there's no level of positive spin you can put on it. I still don't want to have anything to do with rats. I always say that if I ever found a rat in my house, I'd probably sell my house. But anyway, he's the so-called bad guy in the story, but I don't know if you noticed it. He has a good heart ultimately. It kind of goes back to the old myth, the friendly beast or the beast with the good heart. I mean, he's pretty much, selfish and greedy, and he's a glutton and all the bad traits. He represents at least four, major sins, I guess. Uh, but she's able to get him involved in helping as well. So we see even the rat can contribute to the overall good of the situation. He plays a very important role, actually, in rescuing the egg sac so that Charlotte can, I'm sorry, so that Wilbur can then look after it after she's gone. So I think there's probably a message there too, isn't there? There's a lesson in there. The story itself is about the circle of life, and we see it through Charlotte. And then at the end of the story, of course, the little spiders come out and fly away, and they will start the cycle all over again. And there you go. Uh, Death is a part of life, which seems pretty obvious to those of us who have lived a few years. But for kids, it might be something that they haven't really stopped to think about or maybe didn't want to think about. And it's a good message to teach. Other things, Fern is certainly a symbol of growing up. She's the little girl who had this great power bestowed upon her. She's able to actually hear them talk, and you know, nobody will believe her except the doctor, and we'll get to that in a second. But then I find it interesting that as she gets a little bit older, it's like, oh man, Henry Fussy. She suddenly becomes boy crazy, and it's like, hanging out with the talking animals doesn't cut it anymore. And I think that's maybe a commentary on human nature too. She has a special gift. I mean, she can communicate with the animals, but now, boy, once they're of dating age, once you get to be a certain age, uh, here we go. So I think that's kind of symbolic in a way. Um, The barn is a home, a community. I don't know if you notice it too. I won't get too much into this, but each of the different animals kind of has their own way of speaking, and they have kind of their own personality. And yet they all live in this, I guess I'd use the analogy of a neighborhood. You live on a street and you have, your neighbors, and they're all different kinds of people, but you know, they're neighbors and they're friends, and you share things with them. So it's kind of like its own community, even though the different characters are very, very different from one another and maybe clash with one another. Ultimately, they're all a part of the community. Um, well, I just mentioned this. She trusts Wilbur to take care of her egg sac, and he does, and that shows his growth and maturity. The animals on the farm do resemble busybody neighbors. Um, and again, I think all of the, if you stop and think about it, and I think this is very clever on White's part. You stop and think about it, all the adults in the story, including Fern, come across, well, I'll give the exception, the exception would be the doctor, who seems a little bit wise beyond, you know, whatever. But the rest of the people are pretty dumb. And for example, I mean, the main example is when they see words written in the web, you know, duh, it never occurs to them maybe the spider was responsible. No, they attribute this to the pig, and that's what makes him special. Uh, not too bright. Also, there's a couple of lessons about, you know, the environment and not being trashy and not, you know, picking up after yourself and not leaving trash around. Templeton, and this is a great scene in the 73 version, by the way. You know, Templeton is in heaven at the fair because people leave all their, you know, stuff on the ground. They don't use their trash containers, so it's a smorgasbord, as he says. I think that's a little bit of a commentary on human beings there too. Um, themes and lessons in the story. Well, I think we've touched on some of these already in the course of our discussion. Death is a natural part of life. The importance of friendship. And, you know, that's one of the last things she says to Wilbur, isn't it? You know, he asked at one point, why have you done all of this for me? And she says, well, it's because you have been my friend. And um, that's very important to me. And so that's a very important message too. Don't judge by appearances. Collaboration is important, as we've kind of talked about already. Adults don't always necessarily know everything. Um, be humble. I mean, one of the words that summarizes Wilbur is humble. And it's meant to be a glowing word that, and again, it might be a word that kids today, they may not even know what that word means, you know? So it'd be a nice little lesson to explain what being humble is or what humility is. We could use a lot of that. We could use a lot more of that, it seems to me, in our world today, people being humble about what they have, etc. And not being overly proud of your accomplishments. I mean, like I said, Wilbur takes all the credit for all the stuff that Charlotte does. She kind of stays in the background, and she's perfectly fine with doing that. Everybody needs help sometimes, including Charlotte. Children grow up and change. It's important that you stand up for what you believe in. After all, Fern did save Wilbur um, when you see an injustice. Do something about it. Charlotte also saves Wilbur. Be selfish. Be selfless, not selfish. And don't take things for granted because, again, you know, we're all going to go through that cycle and we're all going to reach the end at some point. And I think that's one of the messages we see in the story as well. All right. And then, like I said, I consider this to be, for our discussion, maybe the most important question. Again, how does White ground the story in enough reality that, you know, we forget maybe that we're dealing with something that couldn't possibly happen? And I've mentioned this already, and many of you pointed this out. He starts with a very realistic, believable setting, and then moves into the fantasy aspects of it. You do have a doubting character in the mother. Uh, I think she eventually sort of comes around a little bit. You do have, I think this is important, you do have the authority figure who does indeed validate the idea that maybe Fern isn't crazy. Maybe she actually can hear the animals talk. Dr. Dorian. So you have that authority figure, the doctor who verifies the fantasy element. That helps give it some credence. Dr. Dorian, I'm always, whenever I see that name, I'm always thinking about that one TV show, JD. What was that? Oh, what was the name of that show? I'll think of it. It was a sitcom set in a hospital. I'll think of it. But anyway, also great sensory details used for setting. And again, that was a separate question we just talked about. And I think White does set up a consistent fantasy universe. But I think there are a few inconsistencies. And I was curious to see what you guys said about this. And again, I don't think, it doesn't detract from the story, and it doesn't detract from it being a wonderful story for kids. Scrubs, by the way, was this. I got to get him out here while I think about him, or I'll forget him again. Oh, one other thing, one other number here. Let's say 99. That'll be our fourth number, 99. So I think for the most part, it's consistent, but there are a few consistencies. It is maybe inconsistent that Fern can understand what the animals talking. One thing that I thought was kind of fun is all the animals in the farm can speak or communicate with one another, except the poor flies that Charlotte captures and sucks the blood out of. They don't have any lines in the story. And, that'll go right over the kids' heads, but I think, I don't know if anybody else noticed that. I guess it would be really disturbing for kids to read the last words of a fly, Charlotte, please don't suck my blood. Be very, very disturbing and scary. So it's selective. Some of the animals we hear talk, some of them we don't. So it's kind of interesting. Also, Wilbur is pretty eloquent for a child pig, it seems to me. Also, I don't know, this kind of strained believability. So when the newborn spiders come flying out of the egg, out of the sack, they automatically can speak. It's like, what? Don't they go to, don't they go to spider school to learn vocabulary? That maybe is a bit much, but again, I'm being nitpicky because I'm an old guy, whatever. The other thing that, like the very first time I read this book again after years, the first time I read the book as an adult, Charlotte knows so much about so many different things, including she knows about the Queensboro Bridge. Now, how she would know about that, I don't know. And she can spell, it seems like any word in the dictionary. And yet, she needed Templeton to go find some word that might, help describe Wilbur because she didn't know how to spell. And one answer to that inconsistency, and I think it's very clever on White's part, I mentioned earlier that even Templeton gets involved in the helping of Charlotte. And I think this might have been her way of getting him involved. I have a feeling she was perfectly capable, as she's proven before, that she can write other words in the web. But I think this was her way of letting Templeton shine and show that Templeton was capable of doing good things too. She didn't need him to do it, but she wanted him to do it, and maybe prove to him that he was something more than just some gluttonous, greedy little rat. So maybe I'm looking too much into it, but that's why they pay me the big money. Another thing that's very conveniently left out of the story is we don't get any explanation of how Charlotte came upon this web sack with all these little baby spiders in it. I don't think it was an immaculate conception. So there must have been a Mr. Charlotte who showed up. I always picture like I would always say is the traveling, the traveling spider traveling sales spider who showed up one day at the farm and they had a little fling and then he went off and did whatever. But I don't think White wanted to get too much into that whole thing. I'm sure teachers over the years have probably had to answer that question. Mr. Shank, how did Charlotte come upon these spiders? All these little spiders. Um, you know, and I don't know if you want to get into the birds and the bees along with the spiders. So that's a whole other question. Um, and then maybe some of Fern's actions are a little bit inconsistent. But again, I would strike that again down to, maturity levels. She was so interested and so concerned about the animals for a period when she was younger. But, we get older and we have other interests. And pretty soon, in her case, she discovers boys or, in certain cases, we start to think about other things besides animals in our lives. So I don't think ultimately her actions are all that inconsistent. They're kind of true to nature, I think. All right, so classic story, love Charlotte's Web. For all the different reasons that we've talked about here, and you answered these questions and we went over them today. It works on so many different levels. And again, I always come back to this. It's probably one of the reasons why it's so popular, even to this day. I mean, this book is I don't know, 80 years old now. Probably why it's still very popular in classrooms today, because there's so many things you can do with it as a teacher. So anyway, that's our example of light fantasy, and I hope you enjoyed it. I don't know if you were reading it for the first time. I have a feeling most of you probably have read it before. But anyway, so read on now, read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and do the 2 assignments put together. Those will be due by Wednesday. What is it? I'm sorry. I'm recording this earlier, so sometimes I forget what day it is. So before Sunday by midnight. And when I next talk to you on Monday, we'll go over that. We'll talk about that. All right. Charlie has left the premises, like I said, but I'm still here, and I'll wish you a great day. And let me know if you have any questions or issues by email, and we'll see you soon.